This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, cultural workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black Studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Fanon Che Wilkins, who teaches in the Department of History at Pasadena City College in Pasadena, California. His teaching and research focuses on the history of Black radicalism across the Atlantic world, with particular focus on Pan-African thought, congresses, and mobilizations in the mid and later 20th century. In this conversation, we discuss the importance of transnational solidarity, the complexity of radical politics and Black studies, and the transformative work of historical research and writing for political and cultural action. Good afternoon, Fanon. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, John. How are you?
I'm doing great. End of my Monday, as we were just talking beforehand, end of the semester when we're recording this, and every day is gutting it out.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I was really looking forward to this chance to talk with you on this podcast, so I appreciate you making the time. Welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. Really interested to get your perspective on all these questions about how you imagine the field, about your own research and teaching interests, and so forth. But before we get started, I wanted to begin with really a more personal question and just ask you, what is it that drew you to the study of Black life? What drew you to Black studies? And for me, the sort of companion question to that, which is what sustained you in relation to this work?
Great question. I think that, when I think about my journey into Black studies, it's a journey that sort of began very early, partly because I was raised in an activist family. My parents were very young when they got together. They were 22 and 19. My father had cut his teeth politically in Los Angeles during the 1965 Watts Rebellion. And from that experience, he got kind of politicized. He had joined the Nation of Islam for a very short stint. He was really attracted to the discipline, and he had come across a Muhammad Speaks newspaper during the rebellion. And then that kind of sparked his interest. And so he kind of moved politically in that space. And then after the rebellion, he became part of something called the Community Alert Patrol, which was created in response to, police brutality, police terror in South LA. He wanted to. That organization was a sort of precursor in many respects to the Black Panther Party, because basically they were organized to police the police. A man by the name of Leon Dockweiler was taking his pregnant wife to the hospital. She was in labor, and he put a white handkerchief, a white T-shirt on the antenna of his car, and he was speeding down to get to the hospital, and he was pulled over and subsequently killed. And this experience really kind of radicalized and pushed a lot of people to deal with this question. So about 6 months before the Panther Party was founded in '66, in the summer, the Community Alert Patrol kicked off in Los Angeles. And so that was his sort of foray, sort of in a formal sense, into organizing. And then from there, he got into, he became the kind of West Coast representative for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and helped to raise funds for SNCC on the West Coast. And in those circles, people like Angela Davis and others, they were all sort of coalescing around organizing. And then they later created something called the Harriet Tubman bookstore, which was designed to basically, gather books to get to Black prisoners. So these initiatives, and then my mom came on the scene, my parents met. And my mother was really fascinated. She told me how she had read a number of books, and was just really interested in all the things. And so they got together. I was born in '69, and then came of age in the early 1970s, of course, and then in like 71 with Harriet Tubman Bookstore, that became a real kind of node for South LA folks organizing on a variety of fronts. And so, I grew up in a house with a lot of books, organizers, a lot of folks coming through, many of whom have become famous and at the forefront of things. My dad was also a photographer, and so that was kind of what I grew up in. And so as a kid, I grew up around a lot of books. Neither one of my parents finished college. My mother went in for a minute. My father, did a little bit of community college work, but they basically were just kind of full-time organizers. And so when my family split, my mom went to Atlanta to become part of an organization that James Foreman, the executive secretary of SNCC, had formed. And basically, she became part of a kind of a, I won't say a commune, but a collective, if you will, in Atlanta. And so that was kind of the early years of my childhood. I was just sort of around activists and others. And so then when I got to high school and just sort of growing up, we were on the front line around the anti-apartheid work in the 1980s. My father was connected with something called Patrice Lumumba Coalition. He would later create a radio program called Continent to Continent and African Issues magazine based in Los Angeles that would run for, 15 years or so. He would, be really heavy in the cultural boycott stuff. We were also involved in a lot of, Palestinian work and so forth. People like Ralph Showman, who wrote a book called The Hidden History of Zionism. It's like probably one of the first little books I read as a student in high school. And so that was kind of what was behind me. When I got to high school, I started the Black Student Union at LA High School. And Los Angeles High School hadn't had a Black Student Union. And so I created that. And this was the late 80s. I graduated high school in 1987. Hip hop, of course, was making its way. It was becoming kind of a voice for a lot of us as young people, creatively, politically, and so forth. And so I made a decision to go to a historically Black college. I knew I wanted to go to either Howard or Morehouse. And I was luckily accepted into both and kind of coin flip, but I decided to go to Morehouse, and it was one of the greatest decisions I ever made. And I initially went as an engineering student. I had a brother who was an engineering student actually there a year before me, and that was kind of all the rage. I didn't quite know what I wanted to do. I just thought that was cool, I either want to do that or be an architect, something like that. And so anyway, I remember very distinctly being at Morehouse in my first year, and I was in line at some kind of event. And there was a guy in front of me. His name is Tom Bowen. He lives in D.C. now. And Tom was reading a book called Black Students' Guide to a Positive Education. It was by Zach Kondo. And it was a little small book. And I looked and I said, "Hey, man, where'd you get that book?" And he said, "Oh, man, I got this book at the Shrine of Black Madonna." And I was like, "Oh, really?" I was like, "Yeah, is that the bookstore in the West End?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Wow, let me check it out." He said, "Oh, yeah, sure." So he let me see the book. And so I started flipping through the book, and it was, material on ancient African history and material on, just history in general for Black folks. And then it had kind of prescriptive stuff on how to study and be a good student and, and so forth and so forth. And I was just really moved by it. So I went up and bought that book the same day. And then Tom told me at the time, he said he was a history major. And I said, "Wow, you're a history major?" He was like, "Yeah." And I said, "Man, I'm interested in history. I love history." And so anyway, he invited me to the History Majors Club, and I went to the History Majors Club. And it was at that time that I decided to join the History Majors Club and become a history major. And so I had a class where I was always very active and speaking a lot. And I remember the professor, she would always, she laughed every time I would raise my hand because she knew I had something to challenge her on and so forth. And
It's
I remember
funny to be on the other end of that.
Oh, yeah. And I had there was some football players in the class. I'll never forget this. I was a first year student, and they were older guys. And every time I would come to class, they would egg me on in the back, like, "Yeah, man, say something to her, let her know, talk about it, that type of thing." So anyway, yeah, it was interesting. So I decided to become a history major, and so one of the things is initially when I became part of the group, one of the beautiful things about Morehouse is that Dr. Hornsby, who was the chair of the department, he was really keen on really helping to kind of introduce us to the profession. So we, in my first year, we basically sold Krispy Kreme donuts, raised money to rent a car, and to pay for our hotel to go to the Association of Study of African American Life and History.
Oh,
And it was in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. And we got into, I'll never forget it, was like 4 deep, and we got into a Mercury Sable. Tom was driving. He was a couple years older. He could do it. And we drove up to Cherry Hill, but on the way we stopped in Philly. And we stopped, this was in the spring of 88. And we stopped at Temple University because we heard that Temple University had started a PhD program in African American Studies.
Mm-hmm.
And so we get there and we're just walking on campus. We don't know anybody. We just kind of just stop on campus to look around and walk around. And then we see this woman walking around and she says, "Hey, brothers, where y'all from?" This and that. And we were like, we attend Morehouse College. She said, "Oh, that's beautiful." And so she introduced, "My name is Sonia Sanchez. I'm Professor." I said, and I didn't even know who she was at the time. I was I had seen her work in my parents' collection, but I just, at 18 at the time, I just didn't know Sonia Sanchez at the moment. And so anyway, she said,
run into it.
So she said, what are you all up here to do? And she said, well, we heard that there's a PhD program and we're interested in it, and we're at Morehouse and so forth. And she said, well, come with me. I'm going to take you over to meet Dr. Blockson. So she took us over, and Charles Blockson had a major collection at Temple. He had one of the greatest, most expansive, sort of Black book, memorabilia collections in the country. And so we went over and she introduced us to Dr. Blocks, and he was like, "Hey guys," he was really, festive, and, and he took us all and he showed us all this archival material and all these things he collected. And then she took us around and we just literally had like a couple of hours with Sonia Sanchez, like unscripted, walking around Temple's campus on our way to the Association of Study of African American Life and History. And I'm 18 years old, on the road going to a conference in my spare time, and so that's kind of the entry. And I remember we get there to ASLH. We're in this small hotel room, and we're sharing beds, and and we meet all these sort of luminaries in the field, Darlene Clark Hine, Tony Martin, who had written Race First, Marcus Garvey, and, all these people. And we were all these young, kind of self-styled intellectuals trying to find our footing. And that was where I saw wow, okay, this is a real field. This is a place to be, And so, in addition to a whole lot of other things, but that was sort of when I kind of came into it sort of formally. And then I sort of decided that this is what I was going to do.
So yeah, that drive from Morehouse up to Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and the stop in Philly is a little bit like some sort of sentimental film about a journey into Black studies. It was really phenomenal, but
yeah.
The sort of wonder of it, because it is sort of wondrous, like hearing it told. It's hard to believe. Amazing set of coincidences. But that, and also your history professor coordinating this, come to this conference, come see what we do in history. I've said this a bunch of times on the podcast. I say this all the time in my regular life. I love writing. I love higher education as a mission and an institution in many ways, but I just really so deeply identify as an educator. And this is that story you told at each level was a testimony to what that commitment to being an educator is and what it does to people when you take young people seriously. y'all get yourself up here. You sell the Krispy Kreme donuts, the donut sale. It's such a classic like college thing. But get yourself money, drive in that car, come sleep 4 or 5 or whatever in a hotel. But like, let me show you what study life is like. That like level of really intimate mentorship and believing in young people is like really the best of academia. It's the best of teaching. So I was really touched by that story.
Yeah.
Obviously, all the ambient stuff about growing up and radical politics and bookstores, amazing. But that moment, I'm just really touched by the generosity you got all the way on the 95 there.
Oh man,
People
let me
just
tell you,
stepping
it's and that's the beauty of going to. I tell people all the time that Morehouse College was one of the greatest decisions I ever made. And it's, the HBCU was, before its official designation, but the historically Black college was really founded. It's a mission-driven institution, mission-driven institutions that really are here to serve the most aggrieved, those coming out of enslavement, finding their footing. I just actually purchased, Dr. Marcellus Barksdale just put out a new book on the history of the college, and he was my professor at Morehouse. And there was just a deep level of, investment in the ways in which they poured into us and took us very seriously, from the beginning. I was a first-year student, and here I was in a car, driving to a conference with the expectation that I was going to, sit in sessions and comment if needed. It was, there was nothing, it was totally expected, and so, and then, of course, to have that experience, I think we met a Malefi Asante as well during that time, and so we just sort of like, we're kind of connecting, and then the interesting thing is, there were other students, who were also there who I would later connect with, who become part of the field in different ways. So, from a very early age, I was just enamored, and I was coming at it from history, not necessarily formally Black studies, but I was sort of, developing as a very interdisciplinary, scholar and young person.
I mean, in some ways, this next question I have for you, you've already sketched out a whole world in which to answer this. But I want to ask you, how you imagine the field of Black studies. What's the portrait that you have? It has the origin with a tension built into it, which was first the demand that students had on campus, maybe some faculty, but really students had demand on campus that there's no place for the study of Black life in the curriculum, in the departmental structure and disciplines. And Black studies, the demand for Black studies was a demand for a place to study Black life, to develop the intellectual tradition and so on. But of course, what came along with that was the moment in the late 1960s and early 1970s, which you've spoken to in a sort of different context, which was a radicalization of Black liberation movement that had broken down some of those boundaries that had been habit, which is difference between a campus and a community, between study and prescriptive action, between radical politics and writing and thinking and reading. And so, I think that's the sort of tension at the origin of Black studies, the commitment to intellectual life, the commitment to liberatory politics. I think how we think about Black studies is still really bound up with negotiating that tension or that stress between two aspects of the field. And so I'm interested 50-something years later, how do you imagine the field of Black studies? What's your portrait, especially in relation to this origin story?
Yeah, great question. So just recently, I'm collaborating with a group of colleagues in the California Community College system to create a primer in Black studies for the open educational resource for OER, which is basically to provide free resources that students and faculty and people can access. And so we got together and we're putting together this piece, and I wrote the opening section on the field itself, like sort of the larger field. And of course you come up against this tension, right? On the one hand, you have the history of Black studies, its formal history, from the 1960s, formalizing and, into the 1970s. But when you look at the sort of early history, say going back to the early part of the 20th century, say like 1915, when Carter G. Woodson starts the Association Study of African American Life and History. You think about, Du Bois's Philadelphia Negro that comes out in 1899, and of course his early pieces, and sort of the Arturo Schomburgs, all the early sort of intellectuals or sort of insurgent intellectuals
Mm-hmm.
who are organizing and building. Woodson, of course, is an organizer. He's working in churches, he's working with civic organizations, he's doing all these things to try to, spread, the study of Black life. And of course, in 1926, with the creation of Negro History Week, this is another initiative that is sort of one of the spokes in the sort of Black studies origin story. And from the very beginning, these were initiatives that were happening outside of the academy, all right, in a formal sense, and inside. Um, I discovered, and it was really interesting, like in the 1920s, you had, students at Fisk University who were calling for more um, um, uh, historical courses to look at Africa and African American life, and Du Bois himself would play a role in helping to oust one of the president at Fisk, his alma mater, and so you had within HBCUs where you had primarily white administrators prior to the First World War, Second World War. You had initiatives among Black students who were wanting to see something that would become what we come to know as Black studies, right? That was an initiative. We assumed that at HBCUs and these other places that maybe this was happening, but actually, no, the curriculum did not reflect this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is part of that early history that has to be part of the conversation. And so when we get to the 60s and 70s, and we get to like the formal institutions, the Cornells under James Turner, the initiatives on the West Coast. What you see is folks are, Black studies is not only to serve the institution in the academy, but it's also supposed to serve the people, right? It's supposed to be rooted in community, all right? And this is sort of the early. This is discussions even going back to 1968 with, San Francisco State. So for me, the tension that I see developing has been the sort of formalization of Black studies, the career sort of, development that kind of comes with it, the ways in which institutions are trying to figure out how to bring people in from different disciplines to teach what is this developing kind of field. And we still are kind of there, in lots of ways. Even though we have these formal we have these, departments, and we have programs and so forth that reflect the demographic, realities of different places. Like we have, Africana and Caribbean studies and these other things kind of overlapping where necessary based on the demographic makeup of folks in those places. Or you have on the West Coast, it manifests more like in ethnic studies because of, the demographic, dimensions of, of the West Coast. So I would say that the tensions there. I think that, obviously its strength is its interdisciplinarity. Its strengths are its commitment to social justice. Its strengths are the demands that it makes on departments, but also the ways in which it sort of points in directions that help us to see that, at the end of the day, Black studies or Black study has existed prior to our ability to be in the academy, and must continue. And so, we have people who have, put forth ideas around, fugitivity and, abolition, and how we have to, take what we can from institutions and places, and also organize both, on campuses and off campuses. And we cannot expect, institutions to be just the only place where Black studies is alive and well. So in that sense, I really see, I don't want to say a harmonization between what can be done on campus and off, but I do see that that Black studies must be attentive to issues that are relevant,
Hmm.
to Black people and to poor people and working people, and to the most, vulnerable in our society and in the world.
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting. It was a fantastic commentary. I really appreciate that a lot to think about. Um, but one of the things that struck me, especially at the end piece that you had there, and when you were talking about sort of demographics of a state or of a region, is I do think this is a big question. I haven't really heard it talked about much, but I think maybe we at the podcast should find some people, maybe have a series of conversations with groups of people about even just how general we can say the word Black studies, and how much is Black studies also nuanced and shaped by its regionality. The Deep South is very different than the Northeast or the Midwest or the Northwest or the Southwest. And, raising all of these really important questions, not as like a limit or a curb on anything, but actually as an enhancement
Well,
of how we think about this community question.
it's interesting. I remember my stepmom, or I'll call my bonus mom. She mentioned to me many years ago that she came to Franz Fanon's work through a Chicano studies class.
Yeah, there you go.
So there's a way that when you think about, just the direction and where you can come, she was sort of, looking at, colonialism, and decolonization. And the instructor, she came to Fanon through that course, and she was also a Spanish major. So, yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot that we could, sort of unpack, and sort of think about. Yeah, I think there's lots of regional differences. Abdullah Kalimat talks about this, and he has two new books on the field of Black studies, and he does a great job of talking about sort of the regional differences, and he lists all the various departments and why those departments reflect emphasis in this area or that area. If you're looking at, say, if you're in New York City, of course, questions of Blackness when it comes to the Caribbean, right?
Mhm.
When it comes to, Puerto Rico and things of that nature, like, Dominican Republic, there's a way in which it's going to figure into the conversation in very different ways. And it might, in LA, where the,
Mhm.
where Chicano, question, is also figures into the conversation. So, folks are doing work on Black Mexico, and
Sure,
sort of
sure.
Mexico has just recently decided, or recently included, people of African descent in its census. So, again, these are regional issues that I think Black studies, will be and have to be attentive to.
Yeah. Let me ask you about your work. You work, as you said, you have a PhD in history, sort of interest in diasporic sensibilities, political history, critical theory, and I'm interested in how you think about that collage of interests that you have in relation to the history of the field of Black studies. Sort of where does it fit in that tradition, and do you think it pushes boundaries? And maybe, and I'll follow up if needed, but I'm also interested in how those collage of sensibilities have impacted the way you construct a classroom, construct a syllabus in a Black
Hmm.
studies context.
Well, one of my heroes, and the person that probably was one of the largest influences on me and so many people, of course, was none other than the great Walter Rodney. Rodney, of course, Guyanese origin, he wrote How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. That was a book that I read as an undergraduate that really, sort of introduced me not only to to Africa and African history, but also a sort of Marxist, sort of reinterpretation of African history.
Mhm.
So it was a way in which I was able to kind of come to Marxism, come to sort of Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism in ways that, allowed me to marry a variety of interests, some of which I thought were in conflict with one another. But through Rodney, I was able to see through not only how Europe, but also groundings with my brothers allowed me to sort of, think about questions around class, around sort of how we engage in internal critique in our communities and in the Black world. And so, Rodney, of course, was very young. He was legendary in terms of his, his PhD work, the people he worked with, everyone from CLR James and on, who were, quite influential in terms of how he became a historian. And so I was, influenced and shaped by, his interests. So I initially had an interest in African history, and I wanted to do African labor history. I had a sort of grand design to do this early dissertation on tobacco production in both Zimbabwe and Southern Africa and in the Carolinas. And I thought I was going to make this connection, and the book was going to be called Black Smoke. And I did all this stuff, but it was at the time when the tobacco industry was on its heels, and I didn't think I would be able to get into the archives in the way I wanted to. But then I decided to pivot and actually tap into what I was really interested in at the time, and that was Pan-Africanism and solidarity work.
Mhm.
And so I was fortunate to spend some time in Southern Africa. In 1993, I went to help start a study abroad program for Syracuse University's Division of International Programs Abroad, and myself and Horace Campbell being a disciple of Rodney and a person responsible for helping me to start graduate work at Syracuse University, where I did a master's degree in history. It was during that experience in Southern Africa that I became part of an organizing committee to create the Seventh Pan-African Congress.
Hmm.
And the Seventh Pan-African Congress was in 1994 in Kampala, Uganda. And it was, the seventh of all Pan-African Congresses that go back to 1900 to the first Pan-African Congress organized by Henry Sylvester Williams. And so, but that experience of bringing together, organizers in the SADC region, the Southern African Development Community, and then helping to try to get them to Kampala, and then meeting up with various delegations of folks. The North American delegation was headed up at that time by none other than Abdul Kalimat. Then during that moment, people like Betty Shabazz, Malcolm X's widow, Angela Davis, Kwame Ture, formerly Stokely Carmichael, someone who I'd connected with in college as a member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, which I was sort of organizing in and engaged in stuff when I was an undergraduate. All these folks converged, but at the same time, I witnessed a lot of tension, a lot of fighting, a lot of, it was for a young person who was coming in contact on the African continent with a lot of his heroes and sheroes. It was like, whoa, and so that really woke me up to the tensions and challenges to Pan-African solidarity work. And so that's where I then decided once I went on to do the PhD at NYU and working with Robin Kelly, we started talking about this, and so I decided to take my work in that direction. So that was how I got into the African liberation support work, and looking at that over the course of the 1960s and 70s, and just really grappling. It was really challenging for me, but it was just grappling with how we build solidarity. Right. And what are the terms? What are the criteria? How do we assess, and think about our, sort of principles of connection? And then how do we, think about political identity, right? How people have deep investments in a certain kind of political identity, and how that is never static, but is always changing and dynamic. And how do you capture that historically? Right. So there's ways that we might, you know, categorize someone as a Maoist or a Marxist Leninist or, a revolutionary Black nationalist. But these people, of course, are always changing and their ideas are shifting. And so that became the sort of, my work is sort of trying to capture that dynamism, and that interest in on the African continent and how the Africa work really shaped domestic debates and conversation and discussion, and played a huge role in sort of thinking about the kind of global contours of the 1960s and sort of moving outside of the sort of domestic confines of sort of interest in liberal reform and things of that nature, but thinking about how Black people are imagining themselves globally, and so forth. So um, when that in terms of how that translates, in the classroom,
Yeah, because I'm
yeah,
just thinking about, I mean, it's such a collage of interests, right?
yeah, 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 yeah,
It's like political mobilization, political theory,
yeah, yeah,
history, anti-colonial, post-colonial. So, like, how does that, like, multidisciplinary thing, like, it's a
yeah.
very Black
So
studies sensibility. So, how does that make a classroom different than, say, if it was just a straight history classroom?
yeah, interesting. So, like for example, when I was teaching, I initially started teaching an introduction to African American studies. And when I would get to looking at sort of political identity and political movements, I remember utilizing Nina Simone's "I Put a Spell on You." And one of the things I loved about that little autobiography of hers is that one is it was slim, and students would read it, and two, she talks very extensively about the ways that she was influenced by all of these various political actors around her.
Mm-hmm.
And even though she was an artist that many people looked to, she was very candid about people like Lorraine Hansberry having a huge influence on her consciousness. And so what you see when you read that book is sort of political consciousness as process. And so that helps students to kind of see things of that nature, right? Going back to Walter Rodney when he talks in Groundings with My Brothers, and he, has these various essays looking at how the Rastafari community shaped his thinking. And he was this, Guyanese, scholar who had, gone to school in England and, studied with the best. But here he was getting new knowledge, new information through these grounding sessions outside the academy and how that was shaping who he was and who he had become. And he also talked about Dar es Salaam and how when he was in Tanzania and the people he came across in those spaces, that was a lot that played a huge role in forming and shaping his own political education. So again, thinking about consciousness and development as process, and looking at individuals who people might, hold in high esteem, but looking at how they came into formation, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
that becomes important. And then, of course, when you're talking about, when I teach a course, music is really important. Art, popular culture, sort of figuring out how to, intersperse that into the material. One as a way to connect with students because it's really important to connect. It's really
Yeah, yeah.
important to tap in. I've always tried to utilize a novel of some sort, at least one novel. Even though I'm teaching a course, I've used everybody from Edwidge Danticat's work. I think it was Farming the Bones.
Yeah.
Looking at sort of tensions, contradictions in our communities. How we deal with loss and things of that nature. So, you know, again, I feel like literature is absolutely necessary in a Black Studies course because it's where we find the truth.
Yeah.
It's where
Yeah.
we deal with the where we can't where things are not neatly braided, where things are not neatly resolvable, but we have to sit with and find meaning with, and so yeah, so that's kind of in general, I try to tap in and in different areas. I mean, again, you have to be clear not to get over your skis in terms of your expertise,
Yeah, I mean, that's a
because
challenge, right, of Black studies, actually.
right? But we do that. But I do think that at the level that we, depending on where we are, who we're teaching, I do think that Black studies demands and that we have some facility in a range of spaces and know how to put those things in conversation. So, Baraka's Blues People, it's a staple text. I think that, it's one of the great books on Black music, and it's something that anybody in any area could digest and have some sense of, relationship and understanding of and incorporate. So those kind of things are ways I sort of shape my courses.
I mean, you gave really fantastic testimony, especially with that comment about, the risk or just the ever-present danger getting over our skis. But I mean, that's the challenge of Black studies as a field is what it does to the classroom is expand the archive of what
Oh
it
my
means to
God.
describe in whatever our focus is to describe Black life in a Pan-African context, in an anti-colonial context, whatever. But also the demand it makes on us as scholars, thinkers, and teachers is immense. This is one of, long list. One of the reasons why I get so enraged at any suggestions that I get from my disciplinary colleagues that somehow Black studies is an easier field. It's you have to read a lot more. So
Yeah.
like if I tell my students who are like, maybe I'll do history, maybe I'll do Black studies. What do you think? And I always say, you're going to have to read a lot of different kind of books if you do Black studies. If you love that, that's for you. If you're like, I like this kind of book more and mostly, that's for you. So, well, let me ask you this sort of one of the last two questions for you. Thinking about the field of Black studies, the history of the field, what do you think Black studies has done well? But also, what do you think it has not done particularly well?
Wow, great question. I think in terms of what has it done well, I think that what it's done well is, I think organizationally, I think that the Association Study of African American Life, the creation of the Journal of Negro History, which became the creation of Journal of African American History, journals like the Black Scholar. I think that these are all spaces that really created, uh, you know, um, journals and materials that created conversations that were both within the academy and outside of the academy, right? That spoke to, um, you know, you know, issues that plagued the community. And this goes back to, you can go back to like people like Monroe Worth, who was at Tuskegee, who created the Negro Yearbook, which became kind of like an encyclopedia or like sort of like a handbook that was created every year to sort of update people on, all the lynchings that had taken place, or, I mean, it just had a range of things like that Black scholars could sort of could access. So I think Black Studies has always had an interest in cataloging and archiving and providing resources that people could turn to be able to, grapple with and deal with whatever issues. You had organizations, of course, like the Institute of the Black World in Atlanta, Georgia. You had, folks from Vincent Harding to A.B. Spellman to, a range. Walter Rodney, of course, would be connected with IBW, Akalimat, Abdul Akalimat with People's College. So I think it's done well in terms of trying to use the academy to create space, to archive, and to you know in some ways professionalize, right, what we do. I think that it's fought for space, so it has carved out a good amount of space for our students and for ourselves in these institutions. It has had to really, sort of like in terms of like, you know, uh, you know, um, creating criteria for assessing scholarship,
Mhm.
and then going back to, the St. Clair Drakes of the world, like, at Stanford and, all of these people who, were real stalwarts in their areas, whether it's anthropology or wherever, but, who, came to serve the discipline, and give it real legs, intellectual legs. I mean, we had the Du Boises and others who laid out the early tomes and books and materials, the Carter G. Woodsons and others. But, the fact that we have, kind of coalesced and brought all of that material together, and created a canon, if you will,
Mhm.
that is very usable and valuable and enduring. So that's been great. Um, again, I think back to some of the institutions, I think about places like, Cornell and what James Turner was able to do. Really did some phenomenal work there.
Mhm.
He,
Mhm.
helped to employ a lot of folks who oftentimes, people like Rodney who were between jobs, got an
Mhm.
opportunity to come and spend 6 weeks and teach a course and, get a paycheck, that was also valuable. Um, of course, inspiring our students, you know, um, you know, you got people today. You got someone like Issa Rae, who's a multi-hyphenate artist out here, did Insecure, who's a mogul in her own regard with some of the things she's doing with her restaurants and, in the film and television industry. But she was an African American studies major at Stanford, and we have all of these examples of people who were African American studies majors who went on to do really amazing
Mhm.
things, right?
Mhm.
So that's been really, really good. Um, what's some other things that we've done well? Um, it's giving people jobs, opportunities, and so forth. Now, some of the challenges I think still lie in the convergence of the professionalization of the field and the mission, like the sort of like the divergence, I guess, of the mission, what I think should be the a core part of the mission, which is activism and political engagement outside the academy, and the ways in which that's not necessarily always um, um, the direction that all practitioners of Black studies are leaning toward, right? They're
Mhm.
not all necessarily. Some people are very much, in the profession for, their own professional gain. They're not as invested in sort of, standing up to the status quo or challenging the system in lots of ways. But Black Studies has provided them a kind of an entryway into the academy,
Mhm.
and that's wonderful. And these are, I'm not, saying anything disparaging about any individual. Everybody's got to eat and everybody's got to survive and live. But there is something I think that's important about, understanding the origin of the field, and we have to kind of uphold that, and
Mhm.
that demands, risk taking and, political chops and, being engaged and prepared to fight the good fight. And you hope to be in a space where you could count on your colleagues,
Mhm.
and folks
Mhm.
to be down with you in the trenches. And so, but again, that's part of its maturation. And I think one
Sure.
of the strengths and weaknesses that come when things mature, professionalize, and opportunities exist for folks. So, I think that, Black Studies has to constantly rethink, reimagine, retool, to figure out, how do we move forward? How do we negotiate this new terrain? How do we deal with social media? And how
Yeah.
do we deal with the demands of, I mean, to get a PhD now and to come out, I mean, the things you have to have on your CV to
Yeah.
look relevant. I mean, they're so much different than even 25 years ago, right? I mean, people got podcasts and people got, what sometimes, earlier iteration, people have blogs and they're published here, they published there, and they got this book coming, that, like all these things have to be happening in order to look like are, have some promise. And part
Mhm.
of that is the new media, landscape that we all have to negotiate. So, um, Anyway, that's a long way to answering your question. I don't know if I answered it per se,
No,
but
absolutely.
just sort of just thinking it through, out loud.
No, I love that. Thank you. I mean, you kept circling around this question of just the complexity of success,
Right.
to have built spaces, to have built, traditions and, an intellectual tradition and political tradition that has massive variation inside it. And these are wonderful things, but part of, success is, where do you stand in relation to origins, as you came back to? And
Right.
that's a complicated question. I appreciate the way you put it, is as not a scold of young scholars or middle-aged scholars or
No.
whatever, but really as, this is just the natural movement of maturation. I mean, maturation, whether it's, me and you, I mean, we both graduated from high school the
Mhm.
same year. I was happy to hear 1987 mentioned as if it was not like Tales from the Crypt. So,
Right.
but so I appreciate that putting it in terms of maturation, because maturation is a complex phenomenon, and you really outlined it well there. I love that. Thank
Well,
you.
thank you.
Well, let me ask you then
Mhm.
final question. What's the issue you would want us to all be thinking about, or what's the question you would want us to all be asking in this moment?
Because my work has revolved around looking at organizers and organizing and activists, I've become, as I've aged, of course, like many, I'm deeply entrenched in kind of wellness initiatives. I love all the things that people are talking about when it comes to things like rest and self-care and cultivating compassion and dealing with questions of emotional IQ and things of that nature. And I really think that, and I know that my good sister Stephanie Evans has done some great work on Black women's history, and one of the things she highlighted was the fact that Rosa Parks was also a yogi, particularly in the later years of her life, and had practiced yoga. But what I'm really interested in is sort of new bars for thinking about how we think about consciousness. There was a time when, to have a certain kind of political identity tied to this writer or that writer, or that activist or this activist, that was kind of the bar that sort of kind of defined who you were and what you were stood
Mhm.
for.
Yeah.
But I think that when we think about the kind of challenges we have in our own families and in our communities and in our workplaces, when we think about, you know, consciousness, what does that look like? And for me, we need to, bring a lot of this, I think what some people might characterize as kind of self-help brouhaha. I think it's critically vital to become
Yes.
part of how we think about Black studies, right? How we think about our relationships to one another. And we're starting to get a lot of that, with a lot of the abolitionist conversations, right?
True.
In terms of thinking about how we care for one another, how we communicate to one another, how we grapple with questions of ego, how do we deal with questions of shame. Like all of this stuff really animates, and creates discord, not only in our communities, but our workplaces. And Black studies, of course, is not immune to that. And so I feel like, you know, if we can begin to, bring some of that material into the conversation, I think that we would have better departments, greater collegiality. We would have when we could talk about, just like I mean, so many problems exist professionally in the field that just really revolve around like egoic questions,
Yeah.
revolve around people's, grappling with their own potential, and we know that, or not meeting their own potential. And we know that these institutions and these spaces have never been necessarily friends to us. And we have to find more, equitable ways to negotiate and more loving ways. And we have to sort of move with a sense of an ethic of care that I think will, have a lasting impact, not only in Black studies, but just in terms of how we move in the world and how we organize and how we connect. And I've just seen so many people who I revere, but just be nasty human beings in other settings, and it's deflating,
Yeah.
and it's challenging. And again, we're human, so we contain multitudes, as we know. But it's really important that we take that kind of work also serious, and we hold space for that. And I think Black studies will then, like all other studies, all other ethnic studies, and other things, and other righteous political movements, and academic and intellectual projects. I think all those things will benefit, if we move from that. So that's what I would like to see.
I love that. What a wonderful place to end. I mean, I just, and in the context of this conversation, I can really see how you took this experience in Africa around this Pan-African conference
Mhm.
and processed it beyond the everybody has a big ego, people are petty,
Mhm.
I'm disappointed in my heroes, to this larger question. As you say, I know sometimes that stuff gets derided as, self-help. What did you
Right,
say,
right,
brouhaha? But
right.
as I always say when people, because I have similar concerns, so this is part of why I love that.
Right.
People sort of deride it as self-help. I'm it's like, am I the only one with a self that would like some help?
Right.
Let's go back to the words. But all that's to say, this has been a fantastic conversation, Fanon. I
Yeah.
really appreciate you making time, and I was really excited to hear what you had to say.
Thank
This
you.
has been really exceeded anything I'd really hoped for. So
Thank you so much.
your thoughtfulness has just been fantastic. The episode is a great contribution to this series.
Appreciate it. But thank you for having me.
All right. Have a great rest of your day.
You too.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.